history of Vietnam is just marked by war, lots of war around being invaded by foreign occupiers, either the Chinese or the Japanese or the Americans. So the history of Vietnam is really around protecting our land and culture from foreign influence. So in 1975, that was when the end of the Vietnam War, they call it the American War in Vietnam, where the North and South Vietnam, which had been separated in 1954 after the French left, after the French gave up their colonial rule over Vietnam, the world divided Vietnam into North and South Vietnam, with a communist-led government in the North and a more socialist republic in the South. And then, Vietnam has always wanted to be unified. It's always wanted to be one country. So the North and South engaged in this war, and the Americans came in to support the South to prevent communism from spreading. But in the end, I think whether you're from the North or the South, it doesn't really matter. There's a pride in that Vietnam was able to send America away and keep their country independent and unified. But for those living in the South, like my father and my mother, who were, just because of geography and culture, they were affiliated with the Southern government. And so when the war ended, they had to leave. Otherwise, there were repercussions of staying.
Welcome to the Immigrant Experience in America, an immigrant human library, where we amplify and humanize the experiences of immigrants in the United States and around the world. Listen in as we add another story to our immigrant human library.
Hello, listeners, and thanks for joining us on another episode of the Immigrant Experience in America, where we amplify and humanize the experiences of immigrants in the United States and around the world. We are in the process of building an immigrant human library, and we're so happy to be adding another story to this library today, that of Elizabeth Nguyen. Please tell me I got that correctly. I
got
heard
it right. You got it right.
So many different versions of it.
You nailed it.
Awesome. So please introduce yourself, Elizabeth, to our audience and give us a bit about your personal professional bio.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simone, for having me on this conversation. I love what you're doing, amplifying the immigrant experience just to understand each other better. So I'm Dr. Elizabeth Nguyen. I was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, but my parents were refugees from Vietnam who came to Hawaii in America from Vietnam after the war ended in 1975 to Hawaii, where I was born and raised. And I'm now a cross-cultural, multidimensional psychiatrist. I live in California. I recently published my first book called Aloha, Vietnam, telling the fictional story of a Vietnamese-American refugee family navigating their adolescent daughter's bipolar illness.
Okay. Wow. And I'm looking forward to getting into the book and learning more about the story. But yeah, so you've given us a bit about what brings you to the U.S. Your parents were refugees from Vietnam. So what was it like? You were born here, right? So
I was born in Hawaii. I was born in Hawaii. I actually just got back from an ancestral healing trip, taking my mother and children back to Vietnam. It was my first time going back to Vietnam with my mother and children. I had been there before, but this theme of how migration, even if it's planned, and especially if it's not planned, how immigration and migration really alters the entire life story of a family, of a lineage, and how do we navigate that in the present time, answering questions in the past and passing along this inheritance to our children. So these are topics that are all so alive and rich in my daily life and consciousness, both in my personal life and in my professional work. So I'm happy to unpack all of that.
Right. So what was it like? I wonder, when you went back for the first time, what was your experience? Tell us about Vietnam. We haven't interviewed anyone yet from Vietnam. You're the first with,
I would love
some,
to be a
yeah.
representative of my culture and ancestral lineage. So actually, my first time going back to Vietnam was in my 20s in college. Um, I so felt this desire and need to go back to my motherland where my family was from. But at that time, political relations between Vietnam and the US were still just opening up. So my parents actually were they were opposed to me going back. They still had their own unprocessed fears and traumas around leaving. And they're like, it's not safe for you to go back, don't go back now. But I was so determined. There was something in me that felt like I just needed to go back and understand and see where my family came from. So
Right.
yeah. And so, but that was my first time back, and I was a college student, and I totally, enjoyed being there in my 20s, but it was such a different experience coming back now, 20 years later. I didn't go back between then and then this past month, I went back for the second time with my mother and my children. And it really felt like a homecoming in so many ways. And Vietnam, I would say, is a beautiful country that's along the coast of the the South Indochinese Ocean. It hugs the coastline. It's one of those countries that it's like has the luxury of being entirely on the ocean, and it's so diverse from the north to the south. It's so varied, and there's different dialects and ethnic minorities in cultures in each region of Vietnam, different foods. Vietnam is a lot about, I think, as in many cultures, a lot about food and family and being connected to the land.
A lot of countries outside of the industrialized world, like maybe like UK or some other European countries, US, Canada, tend to be more communal and what I call high context cultures, right? So that's so much across the world, right?
Yes, yes. Vietnam, I would say, is a very communal culture. There's all these communities that you belong to when you live there. There's the community of just your neighborhood, of your market, your family. So it's definitely the relationships in Vietnam are definitely what make it it's very high contact, communal, relationship based culture. We were in Saigon for a few days, and there's just so many people there. You just have no choice but to be rubbing up against your countrymen all the time.
Right, right. So give us a sense for what caused your parents to leave. What was going on at the time historically, and why there's such trauma for them going back to the country.
Yeah, so Vietnam, the history of Vietnam is just marked by war, lots of war around being invaded by foreign occupiers, either the Chinese or the Japanese or the Americans. So the history of Vietnam is really around protecting our land and culture from foreign influence. So in 1975, that was when the end of the Vietnam War, they call it the American War in Vietnam, where the North and South Vietnam, which had been separated in 1954 after the French left, after the French gave up their colonial rule over Vietnam, the world divided Vietnam into North and South Vietnam, with a communist-led government in the north and a more socialist republic in the south. And then, Vietnam has always wanted to be unified. It's always wanted to be one country. So the North and South engaged in this war, and the Americans came in to support the South to prevent communism from spreading. But in the end, I think whether you're from the North or the South, it doesn't really matter. There's a pride in that Vietnam was able to send America away and keep their country independent and unified. But for those living in the South, like my father and my mother, who were, just because of geography and culture, they were affiliated with the Southern government. And so when the war ended, they had to leave. Otherwise, there were repercussions of staying.
So after the war, then it was communism that took over. I'm assuming based on what you're saying. I don't know the history, like honestly.
Yeah,
It's funny.
I didn't know much about it either in terms of like history and politics. Those are not my areas of study, but yes, it is now one unified country with a communist government. But the people of Vietnam, they're really moving past war. They're really moving past they're trying to make a new story for healing and for new life and new growth.
All right. So because all we know since we've migrated here in the US, you hear everybody talking about the Vietnam War, they're a Vietnam vet, and you see we used to see these movies, these Rambo movies, right? That's all we had when we were on the island of Rambo and people coming in. I remember movies about Cambodia, Vietnam was on the list of Rambo coming in to save somebody. So that's all we know is this little bit about the media, and so it's interesting.
In America, especially when you say the word Vietnam, the majority of people will think about the Vietnam War and associate with the war and Vietnam War vets and boat people. And I think as any immigrant journey is, and what you're doing with your podcast is really unpacking these just sort of like knee-jerk, broad brushstroke stereotypes and really getting to understand Vietnamese people and Vietnamese culture and understanding a country beyond just war. Yes, the history of Vietnam has been marked by war, but it's not just about war. And I think we're in a phase now where there's been several generations of Vietnamese Americans living in America since the war, raising, I think, our own children and hopefully being able to define a different story that's beyond just the Vietnam War.
Yes. So I'm intrigued, and forgive me if I miss all the details. Like, what was it like for your mom to finally come to a decision that she wanted to go back, right? And what was it like for her? And how is she today after having gone back? Is she happy she did? Do you guys still have family there who stayed, after the war? And what was that like on your second trip with mom?
Yeah. So writing the book, Aloha Vietnam, was so much about ancestral healing. It was about giving the characters in the story, but really characters in my own life. And I know people in my community who haven't had the opportunity to really process what it was like to leave Vietnam so quickly, because it was, war related. My family left in the matter of weeks. And as soon as they landed in America, they went to work like right away. There was no time to transition. There was no time to process what any of that meant, leaving, saying goodbye, starting over. They just had to start working and surviving.
Right.
And I know that leads to unprocessed grief and unprocessed loss that leads to mental health symptoms. So partly writing this book was not only about the adolescent daughter's bipolar illness, it was about the mother having the time to process what it was like to leave her family behind and start over, and her own healing journey around that. And I really felt like writing the book and sharing it with my mom really helped us do our family personal healing history around it. So by the time that the opportunity came up for us to go to Vietnam last month in February, I guess it was 2 months ago, it felt so aligned. I had just published the book, and here was an opportunity for us to go back to Vietnam. And my mother was super excited this time. Very different than 20 years ago when she said, don't go back. We were super excited, and it was a great trip. And all these questions I had about my mother's life growing up in Vietnam. What was her childhood like? What was it like for her to get the news that you're going to have to leave the country? How did she keep in touch with the family and friends she left behind, or did she not or did she not keep in touch? There were so many questions I had growing up as a child that I couldn't get answers from, because my parents, I think, just didn't really know the answers, and they were still living in this hierarchy of just like surviving. But now that our family, has made it and has had time to process our journey, filled in so many holes that I've been wanting answers to, and it was so healing. It was so healing.
Wow, that's amazing. It's hard not to delve deeper into the history of why some people stayed versus why did her family have to leave? Was she more of an activist? Was she more involved in political activities? Like, why did some people from the South choose to stay versus others who left? I know that for the refugee program, people need to get qualified in order to be accepted into the U.S. refugee admission program. So is it that she was qualified and others were not qualified? So many questions.
I'd love to answer as many as I can. I'll just share my family's personal story of how they left, why they left, and how they were able to leave. I'm not an expert on all the other pathways, but my family was really blessed. So my father, he was very smart. He was very intelligent. So as a high school student, he studied and did really well. So he won a scholarship to go study abroad in Australia as a university student, which those scholarships were very rare and uncommon in Vietnam at that time. But for a select few students, Vietnam was trying to send them abroad to kind of learn about other countries and cultures. So my father went to university abroad in Australia, which was also very, uncommon at that time. But then he came back to Vietnam. He never wanted to leave Vietnam. My parents never wanted to leave Vietnam. Vietnam is very much about you stay close to your family, you stay close to your land. That is, you die on the cemetery plot in the backyard of your family farm. So no, they did not want to leave Vietnam. But my father came back to Vietnam to just continue being the son. He was the oldest son in his family, and there's a lot of ancestral rites that you have to do as the oldest son, or as any child. You have to really honor your ancestors and take care of your parents. But he was also, he was working in economics with the government. And the government was still trying to learn from other governments. So they sent my father to the US, to Washington, D.C., to learn about the American economy, with the hopes that he would come back and apply what he had learned in America to develop Vietnam. But that was in spring of 1975, when the war was, going on. And, there's all these stories of people just trying to live their lives while these bigger political wars are going on that affect everyone, but also you're just trying to live your life. But when it became clear that the North Vietnamese government was going to win the war, and that the American troops were pulling out, American troops were supporting the South Vietnamese government, but they were like, this was no longer favorable. America was no longer interested in sending money and lives to Vietnam. So the Americans pulled out, which meant that anyone associated with the South Vietnamese government would also be the losing side and would be placed in re-education camps and really, restructured. So my father could not come back to the country unless he wanted to end up in a re-education camp. So he had my aunt, who was also very intelligent and also got a scholarship to study abroad in America at that time, married an American who had contacts in the American military. So he was able to come back. He was already on a mission to come back and help the American troops pull out. And he was able to help my mother and her brother and my oldest sister and a few, my grandmothers, she was able to just able to get them out on those last frantic days of April 1975. It's coming up, the anniversary, the end of April was when there was just everything was falling apart, and people tried to get out if they could. Vietnamese people have pondered these questions in our psyche and consciousness for decades. Those who stayed behind, those who left, processing this disruption to our modern psyche around leaving or not leaving and what that meant for our lives and future. These are real questions that have continued to simmer in the Vietnamese immigrant diaspora experience for decades after. And that was why, even for my own family, going back in February felt like a necessary healing piece to answering some of these questions and coming to our own understanding and piece of just our family's story. I think it's still unresolved for many Vietnamese American families.
Wow, wow. And so I'm assuming that up until today, the country is still communist, or has it changed to some other form of government? Is it still communist?
It is still communist, and I am not a politician or political science expert, so I can't speak too much around what that actually means. There seems to be, Vietnamese people are very resourceful at living and surviving. So it seems like regardless of what government is doing, the Vietnamese people have found a way to continue to live and grow and survive and thrive. So it is still run by a communist party, but I don't. The effects of that are so complex.
Yes, yes, I can imagine, and that would be another hour of a separate conversation, I'm pretty sure. But thanks for sharing and giving us an eye into some of the history, explanation as to why some people had to leave and are, have now calling the US home, and are, probably still here. I'm sure, I don't know if others have decided to go back, but yes, I have come across a lot of Vietnamese. I know about pho, right? I've gone to restaurants and tried the pho, and I see them quite a bit over in the DC area as well. I think here in the Atlanta area, there are some folks that's the popular meal that I associate with Vietnam.
Yes, that is the pho noodles is the most popular immigrated culinary here. It is wonderful. And I would say that this past trip really gave my family a real understanding that we are Vietnamese-American, that the American part of that is as much of our identity as the Vietnamese part. And as a Vietnamese-American, so much of my cultural identity journey has been trying to understand my Vietnamese heritage more, but actually understanding both my Vietnamese and American heritage and how they both play such an integral part of who I am has been the wholeness and healing journey of, this war. This war disrupted my family's Vietnamese trajectory to becoming a Vietnamese-American family. But there was so much recognition of how that radically altered our lives. And there was a loss, but there was also a gain. There's so much gratitude and blessings that we've experienced being Vietnamese-American.
Yes, that's awesome. That's a good perspective to have. And, I guess as you go through your healing process, and those are some of the recognitions that come up, right? I'm walking through mine as well, so I completely get that. So I wonder, how did you navigate, being raised in a Vietnamese home? Because I'm pretty sure your parents were probably pretty culturally Vietnamese. You living in a land called the USA. And at home, it's culturally Vietnamese, but when you leave and you go out, you're at school and so forth. How did that turn out for you over the years?
I'd love to share more about that and unpack it. So my family had the blessings of immigrating to Honolulu, Hawaii. So I like to say in the book, for refugees, ending up in Hawaii is like winning the lottery. So it's like you end up in this land of paradise. And yes, my family was very culturally Vietnamese. I mean, literally before they stepped off the plane, they had lived nowhere else in their life besides Vietnam. And yet you land in Hawaii, which is already a melting pot of cultures, but it's predominantly Asian. There's a strong Asian influence. So, there's a lot of longer history of Japanese and Chinese migration to Hawaii. So it was a very interesting experience of my family looked like we belonged. So it's not like we were all of a sudden transplanted into the Midwest or, the South where we could clearly stand out as immigrants. We landed in Hawaii and we looked like we fit in, but we really didn't for a long time. And as a child growing up in that confusing sort of messaging of everyone thinks I should know how to do this because I look like I should know how to do this. But actually my family does not know how to live in America yet. So it was this journey of really understanding that, it is different. For a child growing up in an immigrant family, it is inevitably different than a child growing up in a family that's established somewhere. And now as a child psychiatrist who understands the developmental process of children, I understand now why, as a child, I never felt like I fit in. I never felt like I belonged. It felt like there was always something that wasn't quite, like I just didn't quite fit in. And I misattributed that to, a personal deficit or a personal deficiency in either like being, not cool enough, not pretty enough, whatever. I attributed all of that to a personal failing, which I now realize was not. It was part of being a refugee family. You're not going to feel like you fit in because how can you? You just got there.
Right. And also too, I might add, excuse me. I mean, I have similar feelings even up until today. I've been here now 23 plus years, and I will tell you, I still don't feel like I fit in. Some people will say you don't quite have a very strong Jamaican accent, but inevitably somebody's going to ask, where are you from? I don't know if it's about the way that I move or express myself. There's something about me that just says that I'm not native here, that I came from somewhere else, And so either someone else is going to remind me that I don't belong, right? Or you go into the space and you realize that the way you think, the perspectives you have are different than the people who may have been here all their lives. So I completely get that. And it's funny, sometimes I express it. I have been through this podcast talking with different people and saying, just really holding space for my experience, because I think there are some out there who would try to deny some of what I was experiencing and to say, okay, well, I don't know anybody who would treat you like that. But I'm like, okay, well, this was my experience. And as immigrants, a lot of times we're unseen in the dark, legally or not, right? I mean, I came legally, you came in legally. Most Americans are probably here. Most immigrants who are here arrived to the country legally. But yet we're in the shadows. Our lives, our experiences, or the value we bring is like, it's almost like taboo, and people, and so that's why I have this space, is to say, yeah, no, we're doing a lot of work and adding a lot of value to this country, and our experiences and our humanity deserves to be amplified, to be highlighted, to be addressed, because there's so many issues. I think immigrant families and people who are living this immigrant life are dealing with mental issues. You work in this space, you can understand. And then children of immigrants. These are the children of tomorrow who are American citizens who are going to be impacting this country. And so we need to make sure that they are healthy growing up and being able to participate wholly to our society. So I completely get that about not fitting in, and I'm still working it out, honestly.
Well, I think this notion of belonging, of fitting in and knowing that you belong is not just, I mean, it's I think it's amplified in immigrant refugee families, but in mental health, when I work with people from all walks of life, from all ethnic migration experiences, people who've been here for generations, I hear it all the time from everyone. So I feel that it's a very human struggle as well to feel like we belong. We belong in humanity. We belong in wherever we are, in our families, in our workplaces, in our social communities. And it's something that all humans, I think, experience. And it's a journey. This is the personal healing journey of really honoring you yourself as a unique contribution to humanity and all the complexity of your journey, to know that you truly belong here, just on this earth, in humanity, in your body, in your life. That is the healing journey that I think we're all on.
Join us again next time for part 2 of this episode. We thank our listeners around the world, and we appreciate your continued support as we build our human library. Please remember to give us a 5-star review, subscribe, and share with your friends, family, and circle of influence.